Professor Kate Williams of the History Department at the University of Reading, and I'm here on this typical British summer's day to talk about longest reigning monarchs, because it was here at Kensington Palace that Queen Victoria lived in her childhood home. She hated it. She said, "I had a very unhappy childhood," and yet it set her up to be the longest reigning monarch that Britain had ever seen, until she was overtaken by Elizabeth II on September the 9th, 2015. Victoria became Queen in 1837, just over a month after her 18th birthday. She was practically a child. She'd be taking her A-levels today, and yet she was in charge of the most powerful and the most wealthy country in the world. She became the most successful monarch, the Golden Jubilee, the Diamond Jubilee, the Empress of Empire, and also known as the Grandmother of Europe, because she married her children and her grandchildren across the world. "Today is the day that I have reigned longer than any other English monarch," wrote Victoria in her diary on the 23rd of September 1896, 63 years, 7 months on the throne since she came to us at just 18. She'd whizzed past George III. She became the longest reigning monarch in British history out of all of those kings and queens going right back to the Norman conquest. And now we have Elizabeth II, who's become the longest reigning monarch out of all 41 of them, and also the longest reigning female monarch in the world. On 10th of December 1936, Elizabeth's uncle Edward VIII abdicated in a blaze of publicity to marry Wallis Simpson. Everything was going to change. Her father's new role meant that they moved to Buckingham Palace, and she was now the heir to the throne. The war broke out in 1939 when she was just a teenager, and she was evacuated with her sister to Windsor Castle. But there, even though they were away from Buckingham Palace, they saw the news, they heard Dunkirk, and they were terrified for their parents. Elizabeth begged her father to serve, just as girls her age did, and finally he relented and allowed her to become part of the ATS. And indeed, on VE Day, when the end of the war was declared, Elizabeth was on the balcony with her parents, wearing her ATS uniform. In June 1953, Elizabeth was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom. Everyone in Britain tried to dash out to buy a TV or get in front of a TV. And it was even watched by her uncle, Edward VIII, and he sat on his own gold-painted chair and watched his niece take on the job he never did. Elizabeth and Victoria are over 100 years apart, and yet there are many similarities between them. Both of them are always being seen. They're always out on parade, on walkabout, visiting. Being seen is vital to the monarch. But the big difference between them is that Victoria loved to meddle in politics. She interfered, she took sides, she had her favourites. Queen Elizabeth, by contrast, she remains above politics. She's neutral, she doesn't interfere. And that's been her great legacy, and it's going to be very difficult for those who take on the role after her. Two women, two queens, both ruling over a time of dynamic change, and yet there was one thing that they had in common. They really, right from the beginning, wanted that throne.